The method I'm going to describe now is the Basal Gap Intercept method. Gap intercept measurements provide information about the proportion of the line covered by large gaps between plants. Large gaps between plant bases are important indicators of runoff and water erosion. For this method, we want to concern ourselves only with what is coming out of the ground. So assume or imagine that a lawnmower has gone through and cut off all the canopy along the line you're going to read. We're only looking at what comes out of the ground and measuring distances between those points. For this method, the minimum gap size is important. In this case, I'm using a stick measured 20 centimeters across. That measurement may vary according to your study. Another point to make is the parallax. You always want to stay bent over and keep your fingers on the ground where it's needed for this method. Because the tape should be close to the ground anyway, this generally isn't a problem. But sometimes, going up over plants, you might have the problem of projecting straight down onto the ground from the edge of the graduated side of the tape. For this method, we also count live and dead. We don't concern ourselves whether or not a plant is live or dead, as long as it's rooted in the ground. So we're not counting litter for this method. No species ID is needed for this either. So somebody who's not familiar with species on a site can do this method. And whether or not you count annuals for this method is up to you. The minimum diameter of a stem can be 1 millimeter or a fraction of an inch. And even when a plant base is smaller than 1 centimeter, or in this case, even 1 millimeter, that can stop a gap in the basal gap method. So as long as you have this occurring on the line, on the graduated side of the line, and there's 20 centimeters of open space past that, there is the potential that you could stop and start your basal gap on the same number. Here's an example of how this method works. If we were reading this line, our eye would continue along this side of the tape. I keep my head right above that line, and the gap I would feel with my finger stops at 91. And then I'm feeling for the start of the next gap, and because it is greater than 20 centimeters, I can count this as a gap starter at 94. Then moving along the tape with my finger, again, I'm feeling where this croton comes out of the ground. At 151 is where that gap stops. And then moving on to the other side of that, feeling back with my finger. If I wasn't able to see down in there, I would feel where that gap starts with my finger instead of actually seeing it. In this case, the gap starts at 153, and I move on down the line. Here's an example of how I'd read this line coming in from the left. I'm feeling where this little desert holly comes out of the ground. In this case, it's at 91. That stops that gap. And then using my spacer, I determine that there is at least 20 centimeters on the other side of that plant. And I go back and I feel where that is coming out of the ground along the edge of the tape, starting at 94. Moving along the tape, looking for the next gap stopper. In this case, this croton coming out of the ground is at 151. And then I want to determine where would the next gap start. Jumping to the other side of this croton. Feeling again, because I can't see it really, I'm feeling at 153 is where that starts, and then continuing on. And keep in mind that if you cannot see where the base comes out of the ground, you have to be able to feel it and then project down from the graduated side of the tape. Here's another segment on the line I want to demonstrate. If we were reading this line coming in from the left, this single grass blade coming out of the ground stops that gap at 28. Now, if we put up our spacer, we see that the next stem that could stop that gap is right here. However, it's less than 20 centimeters or our minimum gap size away. So this is not a gap between the plants. So if this single grass blade, might be difficult to see coming out of the ground, is right on the edge of the tape. That stops the gap, and we have to move up to the next plant in order to start the next gap. In this case, this little snakeweed coming out of the ground at 47, since it does intercept the tape right at the edge of the tape, and there's more than 20 centimeters after it, the next gap would start at 47, and then you move on down the line. This is an example, an extreme example, of how small these stems can be to stop a gap, and that they fall just short of the minimum gap size that would place a gap between them. When reading gaps in thick vegetation, you basically have to feel where the bases of these plants come out of the ground. This mesquite is a good example. You have to get straight down on the line and feel along the ground where those stems are coming out of the ground. It may be kind of uncomfortable. In this case it is because of the thorns of this mesquite, but you have to determine where that stem comes out of the ground and then project down onto the ground itself. In this case, I can't even see the soil surface, but I'm feeling where this woody stem is coming out of the ground, and I make my reading, and then I feel for the next gap on the other side and determine whether or not it's 20 centimeters large, and I continue on down the line like that. So again, I'm feeling where all these gaps occur. I can't actually see them in some cases. Feeling at the soil surface where either grass stems or woody stems come out of the ground, and projecting down from the one side of the tape, making the measurement and moving on. This is the same segment of tape that I talked about earlier, except that I've removed all the vegetation, including the woody, all the way down to the soil level, including the litter, to make the point a little better. So if I was reading this tape, I would come along this area right here. This branch was removed, and so all we're concerned with is where that woody branch came out of the ground. In this case at 1140, and then we move to the other side of that at 1143 and continue along the tape, reading and testing to see if there's any bases of plants coming out of the ground. When there was vegetation at this point, I wasn't able to see the ground because of the litter and the excess foliage. So I was just feeling along the ground, determining that that was the end of the gap, and then feeling for the other side, the start of the gap, and then just feeling along the ground for the next base of a plant that might pop up. Grasses often make it difficult to see the ground when determining where plant bases come out of the ground for this method. In that case, you have to get down on the ground and feel with your fingers where the plant bases come out. In this situation, I'm feeling that this gap starts at 1546, and then I'm feeling through all this extra vegetation and litter, even though I may not be able to see the ground, and this one ends at 1516.31, and the gap starts again at 1642. So again, feeling where these bases start and stop. This is the same segment of the tape, showing how difficult it is to see the ground from the observer's point of view. The start of this gap is actually 1546. Moving along this line, looking down, lots of litter, lots of vegetation obstructing views. The end of this gap is actually 1631, and the start of the last gap is 1642. It's very difficult to see the ground level, so you have to get your hands down at the ground and feel where the bases of these grasses are coming out in order to determine the edges of the grass plants themselves. This is the same segment of the tape again, with all vegetation removed down to ground level and the litter removed as well. It makes the point that you can see between plant bases much easier. This is what we were feeling with our fingers before. In this case, we're starting the gap at 1546, moving down the tape. There's no grasses intercepting that, no forbs intercepting until we end up, that basal gap ends at 1631. and then starts up again at 1642. Again, this is what your fingers are feeling, even though your eyes can't see it. The beginning of the gap here, and the end of the gap here. When the line passes over low, woody plants with a large base, you need to still project down to the side of the plant. In this case, we have a yucca. There's lots of litter along the side and lots of dead hanging matter from the plant itself. It's important just to project straight down to the ground and feel with your hand so that the base is here along the tape, not over here. And the same thing on this side. The base is straight down from here as felt at the ground level, not out here where it would appear that the plant is rooted. So again, feel straight down on both sides of the plant for where they enter the ground, and that's the base of the plant. Sometimes when you're pulling out the tape, you need to go through a woody piece of vegetation. Well, it's obviously impossible to go through a woody stalk like a tree or a stem of a thick plant like this yucca. So the tape has to go around the side of it. It's only slight, but it has to go around the side. The way we read that is if you project out from the side of this yucca, the tape should be going through the middle of this yucca stalk, but since we can't remove the yucca, it has to go around the edge. We're reading the straight out projection from that side of the yucca for the end of that gap. And then the same thing on the other side for the beginning of the next gap. The side of the woody obstacle here, project out, take your reading, and move along the tape. I'm going to read through this line now, pretty much at full speed, the Basal Gap method. Michelle's going to record for me. I'm going to keep all the rules in mind, keeping straight over the top of the tape, looking straight down, feeling for plant bases when I can't actually see them. Another point that I haven't made yet is that when you're doing this method, you might want to consider doing it last amongst all the other methods you do, because there is a little bit of canopy disturbance involved with this. As I move around through the vegetation, feeling for gaps, feeling for beginnings and endings, it does alter the canopy structure a little bit. So consider doing this method last. Okay, Michelle, are you ready to record?
Ready.
Okay. Start gap at 0, end it at 23, start at 27, end at 65, start 66, end 110, start 111, end 234, start 251, end 364, start 365, end 416, start 425, end 456, start 510, end 544, start 552, end 592, start 595, end 639, start 641, end 748, start 750, end 800, start 2785, end 2981.